Yep. So I'll be presenting on RMC-BestFit version 2. And just really briefly wanted to mention why Bayesian. So I work in dam and levee safety in the U.S. And in our guidance, we consider life safety to be paramount. And there's no better method than Bayes than being able to combine all available sources of data. You get a full understanding of your uncertainty and to do a quantitative, propagate that forward into a quantitative risk analysis to ensure that we're doing the best we can do when life safety is concerned. But really, in Australia, it seems like there's been a lot of focus on comparing BestFit to FLIKE. So I'm going to dive into that and then briefly give you kind of a live demo of non-stationary flood frequency analysis in BestFit. And that both of these example projects are on GitHub that y'all can download.
Hello and welcome to today's Australian Water School webinar covering flood frequency analyses using new features in the brand new release of RMC-BestFit software. I'm your host, Craig Price with the International Water Training Institute, and I am pleased to welcome each of you, hundreds of attendees from right around the world, to today's webinar. Have a look at the spread. We've got a lot from the US and a lot from Australia. That's where most of it is centered, but some from other areas as well. Before we get into our presentation today, just as a bit of housekeeping, this webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. If you need to leave, you'll get a recording link and everybody will get a certificate of attendance. Do fill out the short 1-minute survey at the end to help us as we formulate next year's 2025 content. We'd love to hear from you in terms of what you'd like to see more of. You have 2 buttons on your Zoom screen. One is a Q&A button that you can use to ask technical questions. These will get addressed by our expert panel discussion, our live discussion at the end. And you can use the chat button to talk with other attendees or to ask for any IT or AV assistance. So today, I am confident that you'll gain some valuable skills and insights that are going to help you in your daily life as a water professional with this content. As a special treat today, live from Australia, from the ANCOL conference, which this year happens to align right with the world headquarters of the Australian Water School in Adelaide. We've got Hayden Smith joining us. We also have Lindsay, Peter, Mark, and Tony as well. Let's get an introduction from each of you. Let's start with Hayden. I'm going to ask each one of you, first of all, where you're coming to us from today. And I've already broken the news here about Hayden. But if you could also just answer us the question, how much of your daily life involves flood frequency analyses or FFAs? So Hayden, over to you first.
Hi, Craig. I'm with the Risk Management Center of the Corps of Engineers, and we're stationed out of Denver. And like you said, I'm here in Adelaide. How much time? Virtually all of my time is spent on FFA in some capacity, focused on dam and levee safety, stream flood hydrology.
Perfect. Let's go over to Lindsay next.
Good morning, world. Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm based in Brisbane, getting to the sweaty part of the year. And I guess a mere amateur compared to the rest of the panel, so I am see why I'm here.
If you could over the rest of us, then,
But yeah, no, thank you. I sort of dabbled in this a little bit, so I certainly wouldn't be getting anywhere near close to the percentages that the rest of the panel would be doing here. And certainly love using the software, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it this morning. And some great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Yes, I'm coming from Melbourne. I'm a hydrology consultant, and I'm currently helping Melbourne Water with their flood program. But I think that flood frequency analysis is really important because it's a way of just making sure that your model makes sense, because you compare outputs with the real world or use the results from flood frequency analysis to determine the parameters in your flood model. So critically important stuff.
That's good. Peter.
Hello. I'm in Newcastle, just above Sydney, and spend half my time in Melbourne, down in Tony's backyard. We write software and work on flood frequency and joint probability every day. I emphasize Tony's points. If flood frequency, data, ground truth, all of the realities of hydrology are aiding us to make sure our models represent on-ground reality. So it's good to be here and good to see the version 2, Kay.
So we'll get a test drive here in a minute, but let's hear first from Mark, a frequent flyer here with us on the Australian Water Schools webinars.
Mark Babbister from WMA Water. I'm in Brisbane today, visiting my office up there. And I guess I do a lot of FFA. Most people would have seen the RFFE, and we've basically done flood frequency analysis on every gauge in the country. We've made that publicly transparent to try and build up a database and access local knowledge on. Always enthusiastic about flood frequency analysis because it's the one method that makes sure you're really in the ballpark. Without that, it's really hard to know whether other estimation methods are giving you a real answer. They might calibrate well, but they might not produce the frequency curve well.
Yeah, perfect. And one thing we'll see today is that a lot of what we're trying to quantify here is we're trying to know more about what we don't know. So you want to know what you don't know. In the background, there's a lot of information to cover today. So I've got this additional website set up accompanying today's webinar, hydroschool.org/FFA. And what I've done here, this will be the recording link after today. It's the registration link today, but the free webinars that we've got for you, in addition to the one today, we encourage you to go back to part 1, where Hayden joined us along with some HMS staff, and we also had Beth Faber talking a bit about Bulletin 17 information. Please do go back and watch this one because today's concepts, honestly, some of the language today may go right over my head, and maybe many of you as well may feel that way. And we might want to go back to the basics here in this first webinar where we cover just really introductory stochastics from flipping a coin with a 1 in 2 chance to rock, paper, scissors with a 1 in 3, a regular die with 1 in 6, and then up to the concept of a 100-sided die that you roll once a year to get your, percent chance of getting that 1 in 100 event that seems to be ever more present these days. And in that sense, today we also have this link to RMC-BestFit. You'll see if you go to the GitHub link, Hayden will reference many of these resources and a lot of background information there for you, in addition to the official site here where you can download some of the software. So we've posted some of the background links here on Bulletin 17C and other items. And one of the topics for today is climate change effects on FFA estimates. And so if you go back and look at some of these additional webinars, these are all free for you to view. If you have a look at those, you'll see walkthroughs of seeing what happens when you build in some of these events, like the 2022 extreme events in Australia and what we've just had in the U.S., North Carolina, which apparently was hit by a couple of 1 in 1,000 events back to back. What does that do to your FFA? So we're going to have a panel discussion about that after Hayden's presentation and demonstration. Lots of additional tools here and resources, a full YouTube playlist with FFA content. And if you want to do more with this, have a look at the additional training opportunities. Subscribe to the Australian Water School to be notified when we've got a couple of new things coming up, which include taking your own data, running them through an FFA, and putting some climate change, some non-stationarity into it, and some of these extreme events. If you want more on the background theory, the Australian Rainfall and Runoff course series, which Mark and Monique have led, includes a course called Flood Frequency Analyses. And so you can see what's right out of the Australian Rainfall and Runoff guides there, including a license to FLIKE, which you can use to get through this course. We also have a stochastic hydrology course as part of our Hydrology and Hydraulics Essentials training series, which Tony was involved in, where you go right out of the black box and do a flood frequency analysis, make your own in Excel so that you can see what's in there. And we're not having to rely on what's in that black box. You can actually see everything, every equation in it, and get familiar with these concepts. So with that introduction, I wanted to make sure everybody knows there are introductory materials to watch first as a bit of a prerequisite. Maybe go back and watch those because today's content will get relatively geeky pretty quick, and you'll see that probably in some of the comments. So Hayden, feel free to go ahead and share your screen. The rest of us will turn our cameras off, but we will still be there in the background answering your questions. I'll be putting some of those questions to some of the other experts who are on board today. But do keep this interactive. Do keep those questions coming, and we will address those when we get back. So, Hayden, I can see your screen just fine. Let's hear from you, and we'll be with you momentarily when we're concluded with the presentation. Over to you.
All right, great. Y'all hear me fine?
Yep, your audio's coming through good.
All right, great. Yep, so I'll be presenting on RMC-BestFit version 2, and just really briefly wanted to mention why Bayesian. So I work in dam and levee safety in the U.S., and in our guidance, we consider life safety be paramount. And there's no better method than Bayes than being able to combine all available sources of data. You get a full understanding of your uncertainty, and to do a quantitative, propagate that forward into a quantitative risk analysis to ensure that we're doing the best we can do when life safety is concerned. So what's new in version 2? We got a whole bunch of new cool bells and whistles in there. And Craig showed the GitHub. There's a whole lot of example projects that you can download. And the timeline for this beta version is, we're going to have this beta open to the public, for review for probably about a year. And we're going to do an official external peer review. And in that process, we're going to, do a lot of documentation and then put together formal application guides. For now, you can kind of, learn as you go on your own with those example projects. But here's the listing of the various capabilities. So we have a new time series data analysis component where we can either manually input time series data or bring it in from USGS and the States, or you can use the Global Hydrologic Climate Network, GHCN, and get precip gauge data anywhere in the world. We can include measurement errors into our input data to account for a variety of sources of uncertainty. Most flows are derived from a rating curve. Those rating curves have errors. And now we can incorporate that. We've added a couple more probability distributions. We've improved the priors. And this is really in response to Lindsay, who's on the panel. He, went through and was comparing against FLIKE and discovered some discrepancies. And what it boils down to is the priors, and I'll explain that in a little bit. We can now do non-stationary flood frequency analysis to look at land use changes, climate change. We can do mixture models and competing risks. So these have slightly different math models with similar intents. We want to be able to combine different flood types. So we might have a rain-driven floods and snowmelt-driven floods, or in precip world, we might have, mid-latitude cyclones and mesoscale convective and tropical storm remnants that are driving the risk, and we can combine those as competing hazards or competing risks and get way better extrapolations in a lot of cases. And then we can do model averaging, and finally, you can look at bivariate distributions and look at the dependency between two variables. So maybe you have two tributaries on a river reach, and we want to look at how those are dependent and driving the downstream flows, or maybe we want to relate peak flow and volume flows. So, maybe peak flow in a 3-day discharge. And there's, an infinite number of ways we can use those dependency. So I'll just briefly kind of give you some screenshots of the new features before we go into more of a focus on the FLIKE comparisons and the non-stationary flood frequency analysis. Here's a screenshot of bringing in a gauge from the GHCN network here in Adelaide, down here by the rail station. And you can bring this data in, and then in the input data portion now you can run a block max analysis or a peak sort of threshold analysis. And we can fit to that data with a generalized Pareto or GED respectively. This is demonstrating what was already in version 1, where we can bring in temporal data, historical and paleo flood data. We can bring in regional prior information, so prior skew in the U.S. is very popular. And then we can also bring in quantile prior. So this is where we bring in our causal information from a rainfall runoff model. Maybe you run RORB with full uncertainty, and we want to get a distribution of bring in, from our rainfall runoff model, what's the distribution of 1,000-year peak flow? We can bring that in as a prior into the analysis. So it really allows us to bring all available sources of information into the fit. This is a screenshot of bringing in measurement error for uncertain data. So this is a record extension analysis using MOVE. And move 3, of course, is regression. So it has errors. You can bring those errors in. And here's the resultant fit where we brought in this data with measurement error. And you get now we have a fully captured all sources of uncertainty in the data itself. Well, here's a screenshot of a non-stationary flood frequency analysis. So this is plotting the 2-year flow over time. And this is using a linear trend. It's fit for log Pearson type 3, so it's a linear trend on a log parameter, which means that we get a nonlinear result in real space flows here. We can see that fits through the data quite well for this gauge. Here's an example of some of the competing flood type and mixture stuff. So here we have a rain-driven flood type shown with the green line that's very steep. We have a snow-driven flood type with the flatter slope black line. We combine those as competing, so both of those flood types are competing to be the annual max flood event. And a competing risk analysis will envelope those curves. And this becomes important when we don't have a lot of actual data. We understand the driving mechanisms. And on the extreme flood side for dam safety, for PMF level flood events, doing a competing flood type analysis will actually better form that right-hand tilt and fit a lot of times. We can also do mixtures. So here's let's say that maybe annual max events, 50% of the time or 40% of the time flood events come from rainfall, 60% of the time they come from snowmelt. We can now combine those fits as a mixture, and Investo will automatically fit those parameters. And we have some model averaging capabilities. So here we fit 4 different distributions, and then we can average them like an ensemble with their AIC, BIC, or root mean square error weights. And then finally, for the sake of time, breeze through these really quick. These are some of the bivariate options. You can pick a choice of 6 bivariate copulants here. Here's a gumball. We can plot different years of normal. We can plot the contour lines and the percentile joint probabilities here. Okay, so that's a lot. Any one of those topics I could do an hour on and really dive into. And we plan to do a lot of that sort of application guide stuff over the next year. But really, in Australia, it seems like there's been a lot of focus on comparing BestFit to FLIKE. So I'm going to dive into that and then briefly give you kind of a live demo of non-stationary flood frequency analysis in BestFit. And both of these example projects are on GitHub that y'all can download. Okay, so what are the differences? A lot of times you'll see slight differences in the credible confidence. And what that boils down to is the choice of prior on the scale parameter. Excuse me one second. I got to spit this gun out. Sorry. So there's 2 ways you can do this, and I'm not sure quite which work Kazera did in FLIKE. It could be one of these 2. Regardless, it gives you the same answer. So it's in the past, it's been very common to use a log length function for scale. So the scale parameter distribution must be positive. It can't be 0 or negative. And to ensure that, you use a log transform. And so that's very common in practice in a lot of different software. Alternatively, you can use real space and use a Jeffreys prior for scale. Both of them give the same effect. So if you have a uniform prior on a log length function, or you use Jeffreys prior for scale, and I apologize, this is very wonky and in the weeds and Bayesian stats, but these give the same effect. So what we've done in version 2, we've now added the option by default to use Jeffreys prior for scale. I'll show in just a second that this now will match credible intervals and expected probability results from FLIKE. Another thing in FLIKE that's kind of a hot topic, which estimator to use in an analysis. So I don't know, I have something covering my screen. Hopefully y'all can see Bayes' theorem at the top right there. But so these are the 2 outputs. So BestFit outputs the posterior mode, which is sometimes, in wonky stats is called the maximum a posteriori estimator. What that is we take find the parameter set that gives you the maximum likelihood, including the data likelihood and the priors. And then we also output the posterior predictor, which is also called the expected probability. A little bit of trivia there. The term expected probability actually comes from Leo Beard, which was the first director of HEC and the author of Bulletin 17B. So it's an Army Corps of Engineers terminology that's kind of carried over. In pure stats talk, it's called the posterior predictive. And most, if you're using Python or R packages, it'll be referred to as posterior predictive. FLIKE outputs by default the expected parameter quantile. So what that looks like mathematically is, you go to a 100-year probability, and you take the average of every single parameter set. So say you have 10,000 parameter sets, you would average over that, and you get the average quantile given a probability. Expected probability is the average probability given quantile. Those are the two math differences between them. So why do we use why do we output what we do in BestFit? We output the posterior mode because if we're translating between different software, it's useful for frequentist type tools. So RMC-RFA, HEC-WAT, HEC-FDA, etc. Most of those tools will bootstrap the uncertainty. And in order to get the equivalent confidence intervals from a frequentist bootstrap, you really need to plug in the posterior mode and an effective record. And that'll give you, an equivalent result as a Bayesian analysis. So that's why we output that to be translatable between software. And then in terms of optimal risk estimator, we always use the posterior predictor. And so the reason is there's a bunch of more math here on the right, but just to sum it up, if we're looking for expected annual damages, where we've accounted for both natural variability and knowledge uncertainty, we can derive the correct expected value with a single integral, so long as we use the expected probability of failure, and the expected consequences. And this is due to the law of total expectation. So from a decision theory perspective, using expected annual damages, posterior predictive is the optimal estimator. You will not get the correct answer if you use the expected parameter quantile. If your goal is to get the correct expected consequence. So we can cover more of that maybe in the Q&A, but that's the motivation for those outputs. So real quickly, I'm going to go ahead and pop open the software. So you will be able to download these examples. So these are the FLIKE examples. And starting with example 3, there's, very limited data in this first example, and we can run that analysis and get the fit. So now let me got some stuff on the screen. So on the far right now on the analysis, you'll notice a new checkbox that says use Jeffrey's rule for scale. Going forward, this is going to be the default setting. So I'll run real quickly. I'll uncheck it and show you the results from what you would have gotten from version 1. And I'll grab these outputs. I got a spreadsheet open here. I'll pop this in. And what you would have typically seen is that BestFit's going to have slightly wider confidence intervals than what you were getting from FLIKE. And so black here is BestFit and red are the results from FLIKE. I don't have the FLIKE software or license. I'm just getting what was available on the website for these comparisons. Now you have the option to use Jeffrey's rule, and we'll run that really quick. Results. That there. And now you can see much, much tighter agreement. Now, will they ever exactly match? No, their Bayesian estimation uses Monte Carlo. So, FLIKE is using an importance sampling based approach, self-normalizing importance sampling, and BestFit is using a Markov chain Monte Carlo. Both of them use random number generators. There will always be some level of difference due to choices in random number generators, choices in samplers, and the number of posterior samples you generated. But you can see very strong agreement now between the credible intervals and the expected curve. One thing I did this morning based off of some conversation with Nathan is to really quickly plot the expected parameter quantile results. So I have shown here in solid red. These aren't available by default out of BestFit, like I said, but you can easily derive them yourself if you want to. So to do that, you can go to the kernel density plot, and you can see the mean. So what he's doing there is he's just grabbing the mean of the mean standard deviation skew for LP3, and then plugging that into the inverse CDF of LP3, and you get that expected quantile fit. You can come here to get that information, or in the parameter sets tab, you can right click and go to summary statistics, and you can get, for any one of those parameter sets, you can get a nice plot and full summary diagnostics there now in this version. And the alternative result here that I've shown is you can do it that way, or you can just to compute the average quantile given a probability across all 10,000 parameter sets. And I'll probably put how to do this as, if you wanted the post process, I'll just provide a spreadsheet up on the GitHub so people can do that. We don't do that by policy because of the need to have an optimal risk estimator. We didn't want to confuse end users where they would use a suboptimal output and then get the wrong risk result in that case. Okay. Let me quickly show some of the others. So another difference in version 1 versus version 2, this example 4 used binomial censoring. So what you can do now is you can input your left threshold, and you can put one flood was greater than the threshold. So this will now replicate the example 4. And we can also compare alternatives in the software. So we can look at the difference between example 3 and 4. So adding in that historical information dramatically boosts the confidence interval, right? So we're bringing in a lot of temporal data, and it adds a lot of value to the fit. Example 5 uses a regional skew. So we can do that run. And again, we can compare that. We can compare that against example 4 to show, regional skew is also adding a lot of value to the fit in this case. And then in the download, excuse me, all of the comparisons are available in there. So I'll pop open example 4 here. Looks like I got a little warning. So here's BestFit versus FLIKE for example 4, and you see, near perfect agreement. And likewise, example 5. I'll let y'all explore the example 6A and B on your own. So this is the regional skew when you see near exact matching out, and that's all due to using Jeffrey's for scale. Excuse me. Okay, so now we can talk about more of that Q&A. So now let's get into some of the cool stuff with non-stationary flood frequency analysis. This is very topical, as Craig said. You've got a lot of huge flood events. We've got one in North Carolina, the one in Valencia that he said is unbelievably large. So what we can do currently in BestFit version 2 is we can fit trend models to any one of the parameters, location, scale, or shape. And you have a choice of these options. The most popular ones will probably be linear and step function, and they're the safest to use without really getting goofy extrapolations. But all of those options are available for now, so people can play around with them. And I'm going to go through a demo that steps through all of this. But the other big thing is how do we actually include climate change projections? So there's a recent ARR guidance, which I think is actually really leading the industry right now. It's I saw a presentation yesterday. It's very solid workflow. We had similar things in Vision in the States, but we're not as far along in making anything official. So here's just some of the challenges with bringing in climate change projections. So we have two emission scenarios here. Realistically, at this point, 8.5 on the right here is probably the likely outcome. And we look at the top left of this 4-panel plot, we see temperature is really projected, to go to the moon. I mean, it's rapidly increasing. It's going to keep increasing. But we have trade-offs in these projections. So we go to the top right, we have evapotranspiration. The atmosphere is hotter. It's also going to increase as well. Rainfall, there's more moisture in there, so you might have some areas. You might have, pretty consistently, we're expecting more more moisture in the atmosphere, so rainfall should slightly increase or significantly increase depending on where you're at in the world. But we have trade-offs because ET is increasing, soil moisture is decreasing. And so we look on this a particular example in Texas, runoff is either flat or decreasing when you look at how the water balance is going to trade off. So when, depending on what you're doing, you're looking at climate change on rainfall versus on runoff, incorporating all those sorts of trade-offs are going to be important. ARR guidance is great in terms of those. They did a lot of review to come up with those percentages. So likewise, we envision you doing something very similar in BestFit, using the quantile priors. So let's say you've done BORB or SCFM, or in the US, we have a tool called RRFT. Excuse me. So in that case, we can bring in those percent changes in the precip and the loss rates, run a whole bunch of stochastic simulations, and then adjust our quantile priors accordingly. And the example I'm about to show you, I think we reduced them by 5%. So I'm going to show you an example where things are decreasing rather than increasing. It's kind of opposite of what we're seeing in a lot of different parts of the world. But in the U.S. and the semi-arid West, we're seeing a lot of decreasing. Okay, so I'm going to swap over and hopefully keep this short for about 5 to 10 minutes because I think I'm running pretty low on time. We open up this example. So this is a site in Texas, and we can see from the chronology plot that we have a downward trend in the data. Just visually, we can see that. We have some historical information for this flood, or for this site, going back to the 1860s. Sorry, my mouth's getting pretty dry here. Excuse me. And we have a big flood event in 1936. And we know that we have one flood that was bigger back in 1853. So we put in our perception threshold, and then we've added one flood greater than. And there's a similar to that example 4 from ARR. And some of the new tools in here is now we can look at hypothesis tests. So it's going to, given that input data, we can visually see a downward trend. Let's see what the diagnostics does. And it'll tell you the inference that you should be making. So we can clearly see here that we have a high significance, that we know the data is non-stationary, and that there's a change in mean. Thank you very much. Water here. And we have unequal variance and change in mean between the two samples if we did a split sample here. Also, we can visually look at our autocorrelation plot, and we definitely have some autocorrelation that persists at long lags. And because it's it looks periodic, potentially, like it might be cyclical. So maybe we have some sort of a periodic process in the climate. So what we've done here is we've run several different fits, and we're going to pick the best fitting model. So to do that, always start with a stationary fit as your default assumption. Use the input data to give you a clue if we have some non-stationarity, but for model selection, use a stationary fit as your baseline. So here I brought in quantile priors, runoff modeling, like I mentioned, and now you can output AIC, BIC for model selection purposes here. So this gives us our stationary assumption, and then here I'm going to pick a linear trend. So you go to the options tab, you can turn on non-stationarity, and then you can choose from any one of those trend model types for your parameters. So I'm going to do linear trend and mean. And I run that fit. This is showing the distribution of the 2-year flow. You can change this plot. So maybe I want to look at the 100-year. It's going to run through all of the posterior parameter sets and update this plot. It'll take it a couple seconds to do so. So this is how our 100-year quantile is changing over time with this example. And this frequency plot, so I mentioned earlier, or maybe with the panel I mentioned this, it's very hard to interpret return periods in a non-stationary analysis. So what we've done in BestFit is we give you a time index to use for prediction purposes. So here I'm outputting the frequency curves for a specific time index, and this is 2021. For this example, this was the end of our data set. And then I'll just really quickly compare with the stationary fit. So if we were to use a stationary fit and we look at all maximum flood here, we can see we're predicting between E to -3 and 4 for what would be equivalent for a top of dam return period. When we include the non-stationarity, the uncertainty increases because we've added complexity to the model, but we've shifted the curve to the right. And what this presents an opportunity for reevaluating trade-offs in water supply. So in the semi-arid West, especially some of our really big dams like Hoover Dam and those you've probably seen in the news are very dry. We have some opportunities to trade off flood control storage for water supply increases, because when we look at, say, the 100-year, we have quite a big drop in the 100-year flows using this model. And what we've done also in this is I've included that 5% reduction in the quantile priors here as well. Some other fits here. This is a step function fit. And then we have a sinusoidal for demonstration. Don't do this. But it's very likely to get poor extrapolation. But, we saw periodicity in the autocorrelation plot, so a sinusoidal model is appropriate in that regard. And interesting enough, it gives the best AIC and BIC. It fits the data really well, but it's too complex. So what we've recommended in this example case study is to rely on the linear model. So I'll just quickly show you those results when we compared my 4 different trend model fits, and even though the sinusoidal has the lowest AIC, BIC, we don't believe that that's a credible model with this limited amount of data for extrapolation. And we've gone with the linear fit, including this quantile priors, as our best estimate for future conditions in the model. All right, and I know we want to get to the panel discussion, so just coming back to here, you can download all these examples and play around. And we have about a year of beta testing, so please, for those people using it out there, if you find issues or if you have questions, reach out either in GitHub or to the RMC email account listed.
Wow. Now I think, like I mentioned, there are some concepts there that get very deep into the weeds, into the maths, and there are going to be some who are very interested in that and some who say, whoa, like Lindsay said in the beginning, some of the practitioners like myself, we want to see the effects of this. I like to know that some people understand the maths, but sometimes when I look through that section of the Australian Rainfall and Runoff Guide, I get lost very quickly. So I'm one of those. Lindsay, we might have you start out then, bringing it back to a practitioner's standpoint. There have been some questions coming in on the Q&A line. Each of the panelists has had a chance to address some of those, and quite a few questions coming in. I'm not sure how many we'll be able to get to. If you see one that you want to see the answer to live, please upvote those questions. We will try to hit those first. But let's just go over to Lindsay first. Any question that you wanted to ask Hayden, or any question that you wanted to respond to from the audience so far? So over to you, Lindsay.
Yes, so I just saw one question. Hayden was referring to example 3, which isn't relating to climate change, so there might have been some confusion from not by Hayden, but the interpretation. So that example 3 is in the ARR book, and maybe that's probably a good point. We are communicating very complicated maths and statistics, and some of the prodigious folk on this panel probably are very familiar with it, but us mere mortals have to communicate it to other mere mortals as well. So we do need to be cognizant of the fact that we are playing with a very, very complicated topic. So I think we need to be very careful with language and understanding of it, and I do freely admit that I just dabble in this, and I don't profess any expertise, so I just want to make that incredibly clear. So yeah, I think maybe one thing I do want to maybe pick Hayden up on, well, not pick him up, but you said the presentation example 3, but it doesn't match what's in the book 3, example 3, the plotting position. Now, that's probably doesn't matter, but maybe you should make it clear to the audience that the plotting position's not affecting the overall outcome. And that's where I got myself into a bit of some knots last year or 2 years ago, knowing a lot more about this than I did then. So maybe it's worth just going back to that, Hayden, and maybe other panelists might like to clarify, because that you use the Weibull distribution and the plotting position sits above the line, whereas example 3 it uses Canaan and sits below the line for the rightmost plotting point. That may tips for young players.
I'll quickly just reshare and show how to change that in software. That's a great point. It doesn't really affect any decisions, but it is useful to understand choice and plotting position models. So the default in BestFit is to use Weibull, but you can change this on the input data. You can choose from median, Blom, Canaan, Gordon, or Hazen. So I can change.
Sorry, Hayden. Just maybe make it clear. In Australia, it's Canaan. That's what I've been.
Okay, yeah, and the motivation between the two is Weibull is probability unbiased, and Canaan is quantile unbiased from an empirical distribution. So, if the reason that we favor Weibull is because again we're using the posterior predictive, the expected probability. So if we're looking horizontally on this plot, Weibull is going to give you a more unbiased fit in the horizontal direction. Canaan gives you a more unbiased fit in the vertical direction in this plot, so in the quantile direction. Those are the motivations between the plotting positions. You can choose from any of the standard ones in the software. And it's a good point to bring up for those folks down here doing analysis.
It is worth emphasising that normal practice in Australia is to use 0.4 for alpha.
Yes.
You don't have to, but that is normal practice. So you're not fixing your bid, like you said. You're just looking at the curve from the other axis.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks for that response. Let's have Tony. We haven't heard from you yet. Let's have you go through and let us know if there's anything you wanted to either ask Hayden or address from the audience questions.
Thank you. So first off, look, thanks, Hayden. That's fantastic software. I've had a little bit of a play, but I've only actually had it for a day or so, but loved it. So I just wanted to go back to the quantile estimator question about the posterior mode versus expected parameter quantile. So Hayden gave a thorough defense of why they use the posterior mode. I really just wanted to mention that in Australian rainfall and runoff, there really is a thorough defense of why there is some rationale for using the expected parameter quantile. So in book 3, chapter 2.5, so I see that one of the questions on the chat was what should I use, which parameter quantiles, or which quantile estimator should I use? So there is guidance on that. So definitely read that, section 2.5 of book 3, and that will help. Also, just to put in a little ad for something happening next week, there's at the HWRS, we've got a paper on Wednesday at 11:20 where we do discuss that issue. So you can read the paper or come to a presentation and we'll talk about that a bit more. So that's all. I'll leave it at that, Craig.
Sounds good. And all of these additional resources, including links to the ANCO paper that Hayden's given today, the papers that he referenced before, and next week's HWRS paper as well, the one that Lindsay authored a year or two back. Those are all going to be, if they're not there now, they will be on that accompanying website, hydroschool.org/FFA, so that that link will be in the YouTube description as well. Peter, I know you and Hayden could probably go spend many hours or days going through these things. How do we best summarize your questions to Hayden or your responses to the audience questions?
There's some good audience questions there, but first of all, thanks for the presentation, Hayden. I enjoyed it, and great to see the improvements in BestFit. As we alluded to beforehand, we're in a court case that went on for far too long. The judiciary and the the barristers have got no understanding of hydrology, and so I just want to say BestFit and FLIKE was the core argument all through this, and everyone's eyes glazed over. But what we actually found, the results were pretty similar if you used the right language in your conversation. And that's the thing I wanted to pick up on, Hayden. There's different language used between the Americans and the Australians for different parameters, and Canaan, for example, and so on. They ended up using both mode and predictive in the court case because they both mean different things depending on what you're trying to do. So my question is, there's a lot of focus on the most extreme risk for dam break analysis, for example. But what if you're doing urban planning where the trade-offs are extreme in terms of society economics? You're doing wealth shifts from one part of society to another. How would you use your software and demystify the uncertainty?
So there's actually a series of papers in the 90s, and Kazera, I'm confident was aware of them. So Jerry Stedinger wrote a paper where he compared those two optimal estimators, expected probability versus expected quantile, and that's the same discussion that's in ARR. And there was a series of rebuttal from HEC at the time. So Leo Beer, the previous director, and David Goldman, where they put together some examples of a portfolio of assets, levies, more of a more frequent planning type analysis, and showed that if you use the posterior predictive, aka expected probability, you will have better portfolio outcomes. And so there's, from a decision theory perspective and from a pure risk analysis perspective, the posterior predictive is preferred, in my opinion, for investment decisions. But as y'all are aware, there was a debate, and Jerry Stedinger is our analogy to George Kazera in the States, and they showed that there are scenarios in which you might want to use the expected quantile result. And I've talked with Rory Nathan about if there's a compelling argument and if it's something y'all would like, it's very easy to add to version 2. So I might just add another toggle to output both just for completeness. But I would recommend, from a risk analysis perspective, use the posterior predictive.
There's some good, solid advice right there. Mark, I haven't heard from you yet, so let's have your response, more questions for Hayden.
Yep, so a couple of things. We did have a question about the probability fits on the Bureau website. And that was a great question because I've seen people come at cropper with this. They're based on old method of moment techniques, which haven't been acceptable practice for 20 years. Use them with caution. You can simply test them. If you go down the river, the results go up and down like a yo-yo. Make no sense. But what I was really interested in is this mixed storm type. We have a particular problem, and like Hayden's views, and I'm working with George Kazera on his TCUV method at the moment. But so on the east coast of New South Wales, east coast lows dominate the upper part of the record. They're about 80 or 90% of the events above, say, 1 in 10, and other storm mechanisms dominate the rest of the record. And this makes fitting very complex, and it also makes rainfall runoff modelling very complex because one set of storm turns up, rains, while the other one goes for 3 days, and you have very wet catchments. So I guess I'm after some advice on using mixed storms, Hayden.
Yes. Yeah, that recent stuff George is working on is very robust. There is something that is going to be added within the year, version 2. I didn't get it, the interface done in time, but we will have a point process option where you can. It's somewhat analogous to the new method that George is doing. It's not the same, but it's close, and you'll be able to do seasonal mixtures, and then you can combine different flood types through the other components in BestFit. I think there's a lot of research to be done on that to work out the best workflow, and I would love to see what y'all are tinkering with, and reach out anytime and we can put together some examples.
Yeah, so I've been working with George and Vincenzo, and we provided him all of the record. I'll send you a web address where you can see all of the FFA fits in Australia if you haven't seen it. It's FFA. My email address or domain address, but I'll send you a link.
Great.
Perfect. And there are lots of other tools that you can get familiar with. We'll have some links at the end here to some practical courses and workshops where we don't just watch people demonstrate this. You'll get your own data. We'll have you download your own data. We'll provide some of the data that you'll be adjusting, and we'll see what happens to it. You'll start plugging in some of these extreme events and accounting for non-stationarity. Those things, and you can see a link here. This is a little preview for it. We'll show this again at the end. That scan bar right there, the QR code, if you wanted to have a look at that and register, that's already available to register for now on the 12th of February. And we will have some additional space coming up here where we will demonstrate some of the climate change calculator tools and see how climate change is affecting things right now. So let's go again back to the panelists. I'm just looking at some of the most upvoted questions. And, some people have asked the question, this will be a free-for-all for the panelists. Is it any different if you had a bunch of rainfall data and you just plug that right in versus runoff data? Just to the very basics. What can you just plug them in the same way? Is the math the same? What's the difference? Let's go to Hayden first for that one and then turn it to the panel.
Most of the time, rainfall want to combine a lot of gauges. So that regional analysis of some sort. We have our own spatial analysis tools. I know that Australia has their publicly national product. We have a national product. So typically, you're going to do regional analysis with Precip. You can certainly do at-site gauge analysis. Now you can just import the gauge data in, get a quick look, and do an analysis. But with Precip, typically we want to bring in regional stuff. The examples with quantile priors, all of that still applies. So all the original concepts come out of the 90s from Coles and Ton, and it was originally applied to Precip frequency curves. And so the workflow, all of that's exactly the same, but there's an opportunity with Precip to really benefit from regionalization. So I would still encourage folks to use regional products for Precip.
All right, let's open it up to the panel. Any comments on that question? Any responses to that?
Yep, I'm happy to say something, Craig.
Sure.
So, look, I just wanted to mention some recent work by a PhD student from University of Melbourne, Declan O'Shea, who's just completed his PhD, looking at non-stationary frequency analysis in rainfall. So just had his final paper published. I guess one of the really key things about that was that Declan and his co-authors warned that even if you do get a good bit in terms of temporal trends to some historical data, you really do need to be pretty careful about extrapolating that forward. And that they talk about the importance of having a physical basis to extrapolate a non-stationary model. So just because you get a good fit to the past, usually some short-term extrapolation might be reasonable. But if you want to extrapolate many years into the future, you really need to think about why you're getting that temporal trend. Is it just climate change? Is it urbanization? Is it land clearing or whatever? Because some of those processes might go on for a while and then stop or change or accelerate or decelerate. So you can't necessarily assume that they're going to go on for the next 50 years. So anyway, if you're interested in that, Declan O'Shea's paper in Water Resources Research, I recommend it.
All right, we'll put links to all of those in that accompanying website.
I'm Tony. I think Tony's raised a good point too. No matter how fancy your FFA tool is, if you don't have the right data or you don't understand the trends in that data, right? I cannot emphasize none of this counts if you don't have a good look at the data, you don't look at the rating curve, you don't know what you're doing. You cannot make something good with bad ingredients. It doesn't really matter. And just because you've downloaded the data from a web page doesn't mean somebody's taken all care and responsibility. So please do your homework. Please look at the curve. ARR-FLIKE to the primary source.
I totally agree with both of those points. So we definitely don't want people to just blindly, I provide that example of the sinusoidal fit as an example of overfitting and over relying on a trend fit, getting something that's probably silly for prediction. So bring in causal information, explanatory data into your priors. Really don't extrapolate far in your fit, like you said, and or go beyond just looking at data. Really understand the causal mechanisms. Fully agree.
So, Hayden, before we jump off this, obviously there's a covariance with temperature that could be incorporated in this analysis. Are you playing with that?
Yeah. So right now you cannot include covariance, not because of any sort of math limitation. We really wanted to do baby steps with the software and, get people familiar with the concept, use the temporal trends. And we want to make sure that when we add complexity, like additional covariates, that the interface is very intuitive and that, we reach a broader audience and that it's intuitive enough that we don't do silly things. But yes, temperature and CO2 seem to be very good predictive covariates.
Awesome. Well, what you'll see in the background, those who are watching this live, you've seen tons of questions, a few of which are still open and lots of which have been answered. But if you're watching the YouTube recording, what you'll need to do is click down on the links below. We will post those questions so you can really get geeky with this, bringing nerdy back here for everybody. And then just a reminder that we did go through the very basics. If you go back to that part 1 from 2 years ago, where you start from scratch, just open up BestFit and start plugging in data and then start looking at that. Now that's dangerous, and you'll see some comments in the background about outliers and how to deal with those and PILFs and things like that. It's dangerous to just stick in data and just hit run, but it's very easy to do, and this is very intuitive software. I guess one of the questions then back to the panel. I saw an article in, that I think went around, AP article in many sources about the events in North Carolina. So stating these back-to-back 1 in 1,000 events. And so, again, back to the basics. If you asked somebody that question, what was this event? The answer to that question using previous data until that event occurred would be different than if you actually asked somebody, well, what event what event was this? Was this a 1 in 1,000? Well, if you built that in, you'd have a different answer. And if these were back-to-back events, you'd have a different answer before, then you'd have a different answer in between, and you'd have a different answer after the second one. Should we be doing this straight away? And should we be rejigging our FFAs for these extreme events? Because if you wait long enough and build the other events back into it over time, you may bring that back down. And as a preview to that, this is where Mike Bartels from the HMS team actually stepped through an example and did that and watched what happened over time as things got more back to normal versus the new normal. So Hayden, first to you over on that question, a very basic one that a couple of people have alluded to.
Sorry, could I jump in, Hayden? Sorry. Brisbane's quite famous for having the January and February 1893 flood events, so it's not a recent occurrence, Cray. Having back-to-back large floods. So, but yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, there's actually a great example I provided in the first folder of temporal causal expansion. If you don't mind, I'll share real quick where I could be able to cover more.
Yeah, perfect.
So this original example was profiled exactly for this case, and it's Viglione et al. 2013. Let me save and close and open it up real quick. And in this example, they look at a really big event that happened in 2005. So if we look at the data before 2005, and then with 2005, you can't really see up here in the legend, but the point is way up here, about three times larger. And so the whole basis of this is to really make sure that we bring in temporal and causal data. So when we bring in, excluding that 2005 fit, let's bring in all the available historical information. This is, I believe, in in Switzerland or Italy, I can't recall. But they have a lot of data going back several hundred years. So they bring in perception threshold and some big historical events. And then they bring in causal data in a quantile prior. So this is, again, we're not including the 2005 events. So we brought in all of our historical data, we brought in our quantile prior. And now if we look at the actual historical point, it falls right in line with that data. So what to avoid these big, huge busts, these big outlier events, we really encourage everyone to bring as much data to the table as possible. Bring in paleo data, bring in historical data, and bring in those quantile priors to inform that right-hand tail of the curve. You're going to do a lot better to avoid these big, huge outlier busts that we see in places like North Carolina. The products that, they're coming up with that 1,000-year flood in North Carolina because they don't have any of this data included. They're purely using gauge data. They're using very small regions of influence in the area. So it's just at-site precip gauge data, and they're not including all the available sources of data, which would have given them a way better understanding of how rare that is.
And Hayden, if you just plug that event in without the historical information prior to the record, I presume you'd have huge confidence limits anyway. So, so trying to nail down a probability is ridiculous.
So here is the difference between the two. So if we just look at the systematic data by itself and we include that outlier, we get a very different perception than if we bring in other sources of data and put that point into context. So really encourage everyone to read that series of papers. There's three parts in WRR 2013, and it covers the sort of recipe with Bayesian flood frequency. So I highly encourage folks to pick that up.
Excellent. And if you want to see a discussion on that with the Australian Water School webinars, panel discussion on the extreme events in Australia, we had a very similar discussion. What we'll do, we're running we'll run a couple minutes over here, I think, but I want to give everybody a chance to offer some closing remarks. And I know, Hayden, you got to get back to the conference. So let's go back around through there. I think Tony had to leave us, but if we go back through the panelists, and let's have Lindsay start. Just any closing remarks before we close up here?
No, I just want to thank Hayden and for making the time and the rest of the panelists. So this is a fantastic opportunity, and I probably should say a fantastic work you do too, Cray, and the Water School. I think it's a fantastic a resource that you're providing for the greater community. So thank you, and all credits to all of you. So for us mere mortals to try and keep up.
Well, thanks for the papers you've put out there that certainly has added to the discussion. Peter, closing remarks.
Yes, same as Lindsay. Thanks everyone for attending and the great discussion. But Hayden, I enjoyed your presentation, mate, and I'll annoy you with some emails and some buttons. I think this is just early days of resolving some of the key questions about non-stationarity. So I don't think that it's resolved yet, but it's great to see you talking about starting the process. Thank you.
Perfect. Mark.
Yeah, look, thanks for the presentation, Hayden. It was great. One thing we probably didn't touch on much today, which is important in Australia, is multiple grubs and becks, or how you filter out these low flows that are affecting your curve. Very variable climate in Australia. Whatever causes these low flows is not really relevant to looking at extreme floods, and please keep that in mind.
PILFs. If you don't know about PILFs, look that up.
Let's try to avoid acronyms.
Exactly. All right, Hayden. You'll see some QR codes and such coming up in the background, but Hayden, bring it home for us. Any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just second Lindsay and everybody else. I really appreciate the opportunity. This is a great platform that y'all do, and a great resource of information. And Australia is really on the front edge of a lot of these complex problems. We look to y'all and we get inspiration from y'all. So really hope we can continue these sort of calls and collaboration. Look forward to the next time.
I appreciate that. And again, look at what's upcoming. If you want to try this yourself with your own data, register for one of our first sessions of the new year in 2025, which will include doing this on your own, seeing what happens when you incorporate these extreme events and how to build non-stationarity into your flood frequency assessments. So with that, we thank all of the attendees for being with us today, for your questions. We'll post those to the websites. And thanks to the presenters for coming on board and sharing your expertise with us. It's been very enriching for me. Some of it went over my head, but I need to go back and do a little more homework and go back and rewatch some of those prerequisites. Thanks for that software, the BestFit 2.0 software. I've been giving that a play. And again, it's very intuitive. You just start plugging in the numbers and you can see some of these things yourself. So give it a play. Don't just watch others do it. Try it yourself. It's free. It's downloadable right now. Go to that GitHub link and you can try it yourself. So with that, thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks to the presenters. We'll see you next time with the Australian Waters.